Well, the idea of a web documentary, given the purpose of our centre, seemed appropriate as a way of marking that Keynes died 70 years ago on the 21st of April 1946. And indeed, in February of 80 years ago, he published his final great book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. So it's a year of anniversaries of Keynes, and it seemed appropriate to mark them, because when Keynes died, he was truly one of the great figures of the 20th century. He ranked up there with Einstein and other people in terms of his influence on the world, and in terms of particularly his contribution to shaping the post-war world, which he wanted very much to be obviously a world of peace and harmony and prosperity. And having been through 2 world wars, the horrible 1914-18 experience, and then this awful Second World War, the 20th century, as historians have said, is probably been the bloodiest century in history. And Keynes was very sensitive to that and to the need to make sure that economic relations promoted peace and reconciliation. And that goes back to his first major book he wrote after the First World War, when he was a civil servant at the Versailles Treaty negotiations and resigned on matters of principle because of the way the political leaders were treating the vanquished Germans. He foresaw that this would lead to further trouble and further war, and he wrote his amazing book, The Economic Consequences of Peace, which established his name internationally right at the start. And one has to remember, this was a relatively young civil servant who had the courage to stand up and state his principles and say the politics was, in his view, evil, and to write a polemic which has withstood the test of time in terms of its wisdom far better than the political leaders who were purportedly shaping a world for peace. Anyway, we got another war, as Keynes actually foresaw, and during that war he made obviously heroic efforts to deal with problems of financing the war without inflation and so on. But he made huge efforts about the post-war world, and indeed these efforts probably wore his heart down, and he died shortly after the Savannah Conference of basically a weak heart and it giving out. So here's a great figure of the 20th century who essentially sacrificed his health and his well-being, his life, for all of us, gave us through his ideas and thinking decades of prosperity, and has given us resources for thinking about the world in which we live today still. So it seemed appropriate that it should be noted, at least by a centre calling itself the Keynes Centre, in a modern format of a web documentary. And you'll see from that the person that we call Keynes, the economist, was a man of extraordinary diversity, extraordinary talent, and extraordinary humanity. And it's worth having a look just to see that this person was truly one of the greatest figures since the 20th century. My interest in Keynes began actually in my teenage years, around the period of being 16, and it was, like I suppose many of these things, prompted by experience and, I suppose to be frank about it, not great awareness, but nevertheless a growing awareness of the implications of emigration. The 1960s was still a period of very heavy emigration from Ireland, and the way a 15 and 16-year-old became aware of it was because every summer our heroes in our basketball and soccer and Gaelic football and hurling teams, and indeed on our street games, always disappeared. They were gone to England or America. So one became aware of this exodus every summer after the leaving certificate examinations or the intermediate examinations, and began to wonder, why is it that people have to leave and our teams get decimated and so on. So that led to the question of employment. Somehow it became an awareness in me, and I went to the local library to see what I could dig out, and in the process came across a few books by Keynes and Schumpeter and Adam Smith and people like that, and realised there was a subject called economics, and in that sense began to plant, I suppose, the seeds, or the seeds were planted. Later on, when I went to university, I did economics, and I was lucky that one of my second year teachers, a really good guy as a teacher, was open to actually reading Keynes and having Keynes as my essay topic, which wouldn't have been the normal at the time. So I wrote an essay on the general theory, his great book at the time, and that solidified my interest, and I continued then through postgraduate and doctoral studies. And for my doctoral studies, I worked on the employment problem in Ireland, and came back to Ireland and continued to work on that, working at the ESRI as well as at UCC. And discovered that while Keynes was considered the founder of the type of statistical and mathematical modelling we were doing, as I went back to Keynes, I discovered it was quite a different book than I expected, even though I'd been reading it on and off for some years. So I got into teaching with a colleague of mine, my former professor at UCC, my predecessor as professor, and we taught for many years a postgraduate seminar on the general theory, and eventually we wrote a book together on it. So this is my trajectory with Keynes. He's been part of the company I keep for a long part of my life now at this stage, and while I wouldn't purport to know what he would think about things today or anything like that, I feel I know him fairly well, as I said, as the company I've kept, or has kept me company for a long time. Keynes, first and foremost, was concerned about how we think about things. While the general perception of him and the general popular presentation of him is as an economist, and indeed as probably the most influential economist, not only of the 20th century, but since the 20th century, even today, he would certainly, I think, generally be considered the most influential economist, with a few others like Karl Marx, Adam Smith, and so on. But his overall interest, I think, was primarily about how we think, and particularly how we think about a world of uncertainty, or think in a world of uncertainty. And indeed, his fellowship treatise for King's College, Cambridge, was, when published in 1921, was called a treatise on probability. Really was addressing the question: how do we know anything in a world where the future is unknowable and unknown? In other words, how do we live and make decisions and guide our lives in a world of uncertainty? That theme went through all his work. While he wrote his first economics book, The Tract on Monetary Reform, on the quantity theory of money approach to prices, it fell in the background a little there because of the nature of the theory. But he soon came back to this theme in terms of struggling with it for his next big work, the treatise on money, which he considered and admitted had not succeeded. But he very honestly said this is the best he could do at the time, and he was giving it to the world at the time for people to think about. But he didn't consider it a great work that he wanted to produce. But it was a work that again brought home to him the need to think through, how do we think about uncertainty? And of course he achieved his goal pretty much in the great book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which is his magnum opus, as people would say. He continued that through to a very important article he wrote that is readable by anybody. It's not an article for only specialists in economics, on the general theory of employment in 1937 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Now anybody can get access to that, and it's well worth reading. And in that article and the book which came before it, and the article really is a summary of the main theme of the book, the central issue that clearly dominated his life comes clear. It's about living in a world of uncertainty and how we think about it. And it's well recommended to anyone to read, particularly people in business. I might say more a little bit about that in a minute. But like chapter 12 of the general theory on investment, it's highly readable and would be very much good reading for anybody in business to look at this. Because he's generally presented narrowly as an economist, it's worth placing him back in his context. While Keynes lectured within the economics program at Cambridge, it's hard to see that he would see himself as a narrow economist. I don't think he did, and he could have. He lived such a diverse life from the arts. He was a civil servant. He was, as I said, a patron of the arts, but he was also very much a business person. Now, not only a business person in terms of his involvement in the arts from the business point of view, but he was chairman of an insurance company, a mutual fund company, and so on. And he had a great direct knowledge of business, and indeed one could almost perceive him to be a business person who happened to theorize about business economy and about business and about the economy in general, rather than an economist who happened to know a bit about business. So perhaps he was the last of those kind of people that had been a feature of economics that in terms of its early years in its development, where people had, they were of a wider caliber, a wider interest, and within that they produce works of ideas and thought that have come to be labelled and characterised as economics. So if we go back to Keynes and Business, he very much was a business person. And in that sense, he used his experience and drew on that when he was theorising about the economy and really theorising about the business economy. Generally, again, he's presented in the media as a narrow economist concerned with government spending in the economy, particularly government spending to pull economies out of recession, and indeed even narrower than that, deficit finance government spending. So while that is not an incorrect reading of the implications of his work, that's not really what his great work is about. His great work is really about the business economy. His central person, his central character in this theoretical work is actually the entrepreneur. He very much develops an entrepreneurial theory of the business cycle and the fluctuations in the economy, but he starts very clearly with the individual entrepreneur. So he's starting with the individual business person, and he's building his idea, his apparatus, he's building that up from the entrepreneur. So he's grounded in business, he's talking about business, and he's theorizing about business. Why I think business people, business leaders should look at Keynes in terms of his pervasive theme of uncertainty is because, of course, business by its nature is inherently uncertain, and business leaders operate in a world of pervasive uncertainty. So what did Keynes do from their point of view? Well, we all think with concepts and we think with theories. And what Keynes did was show us how to conceptualize for a world of uncertainty, how to construct theory and how to create concepts to deal with the issue of uncertainty, so that we have tools of thought, or as he would call it, an apparatus of mind for thinking about uncertainty. Now, the fact that he was focused on the economy, or as I would say he's focused narrowly on business, doesn't preclude the bigger point, that he's looking at how do we actually think in a world of uncertainty, how do we theorize about it, how do we create concepts to allow us to think and bring order to our thinking about a world of uncertainty. So while it's specifically focused on the business economy and therefore of direct interest to business people, there is the wider point which I think has not probably been followed through sufficiently, and that is that he's actually showing how to theorize about a world of uncertainty. But coming back to the business point, of course, given that his focus was the business economy, and that of course is what the world in which business people operate and focus on, he's showing these people how to actually think about their world. And so for that reason, I think he's actually essential reading. And while much of his writing was debates with economists, business people can leave that aside. That's not really central. That was the context in which he worked. It was the foil against which he played in order to stimulate his thinking. Business people should look at him in terms of the positive side, so to speak, of what he produced. And there's a very good now selection of his work available. He was a prolific writer and indeed made quite a sum of money, a fortune out of his writings. He was a prolific writer, so it would be hard for ordinary lay people to get a handle on this stuff. But nowadays, there's no excuse. Penguin have produced a wonderful collection called The Essential Keynes, edited by his great biographer Robert Skidelsky, and it gives a great sampling of one of the most extraordinary minds of the 20th century across the range of his interests. Keynes was not a narrow economist. Indeed, he probably wouldn't even have considered himself to be a narrow economist. He just happened to work in economics at times, but so did he work in the arts, in culture, in business, in finance, in all sorts of areas, international relations, and so on. So this book would be very much worthwhile for business people to peruse and get to know Keynes, and particularly get to know the person who showed us, above all, how to think about a world of uncertainty. I mentioned a while ago that Keynes was dealing with what we call the economy, in other words, an abstraction out of the complexity of life that we label the economy, and in that sense it's a concept that we construct to help us think about a particular aspect of human affairs. Keynes made the point that, or the point I was making earlier, was that Keynes was primarily concerned with how we think. And he saw us, and as he put it, we think in terms of models. Now, by that he meant the sense of the way the world works. And in that sense, he also meant the economy as we abstract it. So when he says we think in terms of models, he knows that we don't know and can't know the world directly. We must have an intermediate step. The material, the object of our theorizing, is itself an abstraction. It's a construct. And we have to recognize that. So this is where his idea that when he's theorizing, he's constructing an apparatus of the mind. And we have to remember then that the implication of that is theory is not a description of the world. It couldn't be, as the cliche, or originally not a cliche, but as the cliche now has it, the map is not the territory. So Keynes knew this very well, and knew that it was a mind using the theory as a tool of thought that led to good thinking, good results. It wasn't that he saw theory as a description of the world, simplified or otherwise, and you looked at the world as if that's the way it was in the theory and the model, as we call it in a different use of the word today. He very much said there's always two things. There's the apparatus and there's the mind that uses the apparatus. Just like there's a hammer and there's the person that uses the hammer. And the skill of the carpenter with the hammer or the saw or the chisel determines the outcome of the analysis. When similarly with an apparatus of mind, the quality of the apparatus isn't the only thing. The quality of the mind using it is equally important. And of course, in the case of Keynes, the quality of the mind was superb. It was excellent, and which is why so much of his work is so good. I mentioned my interest in Keynes emerging from personal experience in my teens about life in Ireland, and particularly the dominance of the fact of emigration in our lives. And that led me to the issue of employment, which led me to discovering Keynes, first of all, in the local library. That interest continued, and eventually I became a professional economist, as they would say. In other words, an academic economist in a university. So for nearly 3 decades, I worked in the narrow field, if you like, of economics, and worked a lot with Keynes and his ideas, but was always finding he was bringing me to the borders and pushing me over. For example, there's the misperception of people that economics deals with something very narrow called economic man. I'm not at all sure about where economic woman went, but Homo economicus, as they like to call it, in the way the anthropologists and people talk about primitive people and early man and all that kind of thing. So the idea of Homo economicus was well understood by Keynes, and he wouldn't have accepted it. Keynes had a very clear sense that he was dealing with people in their totality and their roundedness, in their diversity and their plurality, and he was always aware of that. He would, of course, as a theorist, have abstracted certain features from that complexity of the world, and indeed the very notion of an economy is an abstraction. We only have the world, or whatever we want to call it. We only have this life we live. And it's a very complex, convoluted, changing world. What economists do, but sometimes forget, and often the public isn't made aware of it by the economists, is we abstract from that mess a notion called the economy. But the economy is a concept, it's a conceptualization. It's a construct made by us to help us think about a small part of life. But Keynes would always have been aware that there was the wider dimensions always going on. So when it came to my time to finish up as head of a department and all of that, I was thinking, well, nowadays retirement doesn't mean a whole lot to people, so what next? And I thought, what better than try to bring a wider perspective of Keynes to the business community. His primary concern, as I mentioned, was how we think, and in particularly, how do we think about and in a world of uncertainty, which of course is what business is about. And that's why the centre emerged as an idea to link the thinking of Keynes and the way of his thinking and what he showed us with the practice of business. And that's what we're working on in the centre.